In the war tents of generals and the stone halls of princes, one obsession moved through the shadows. Its name was the sea, that vast blue abyss swallowing armies whole and confessing nothing of its dead. Syria breathed conquest and crimson glory in those early decades of Islam's great expansion. The victorious faithful stood on the Mediterranean shore, staring at a horizon whose iron secrets belonged entirely to someone else. Cyprus loomed across those glittering straits like a fortress suspended between heaven and cold malice. Byzantine warships launched from it, raided the coastlines, and vanished before Muslim eyes could even name the insult. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, governor of Syria, born of Umayyad iron, witness to Islam's birth and its expanding empire, watched those Byzantine hulls with a vision no man beside him yet possessed. Born in Mecca, where the Quraysh punished dangerous ideas like enemy soldiers, he had forged in that crucible a mind of rare and lethal design. It transmutes ambition into strategy and strategy into conquered dust. He carried one iron doctrine, returning to it each time the salt wind struck his face on the Syrian shore. While Byzantium commands the sea, we are prisoners, and prisoners do not write the destiny of civilizations. He wrote to Caliph Umar, a dispatch fusing military intelligence with iron persuasion. Cyprus is a Byzantine dagger plunged into the Muslim coastline, he argued, and only a fleet of our own can pull it free. Umar answered as only a leader who carries an entire nation's mortal souls can answer. No, Muawiya, the sea is great and terrible, and I will not cast the Muslims upon it. Their lives exceed my own. Muawiya fell silent before the decree, but never silenced the idea burning within him. Ideas born from the womb of necessity do not die by edict. They wait, patient as iron buried deep in stone. When Uthman became caliph, Muawiya returned carrying the same demand with heavier arguments still. Byzantine coastal raids had multiplied as though the sea itself were constructing his persuasive case, strike by merciless strike on his behalf. Osman granted permission under one condition alone: compel no man, let only willing volunteers sail. A sailor who hates the abyss beneath him builds nothing within it except catastrophe and useless death. In that singular moment, Muawiya gripping the caliph's letter on the Syrian shore while the Mediterranean blazed before him like a vast hammered mirror, a history began, whose destination no living man yet knew. A son of the desert who had never stood on a ship's deck now wished to build a fleet. His doubters whispered this like prophecy, never understanding that great commanders need not know everything, only where to find those who do. The Syrian lands harbored within their ancient bones entire peoples who had lived beside the sea since before memory. These were Phoenicians and their heirs, men for whom the craft of hulls and sails ran in the blood like a dark inherited verse. Conquered Egypt held another buried treasure, the Copts, sons of the Nile and the White Sea, who had served in Byzantine fleets for generations. They guarded naval secrets the way a scholar guards his most dangerous and most irreplaceable page. Muawiya recruited them not through tyranny but through persuasion and cold pragmatism. A resentful sailor builds only shipwrecks, but a sailor who believes in his purpose can outlast whatever storm the dark abyss manufactures against him. The Syrian harbor shipyards erupted into life in a spectacle those shores had not witnessed since the age of pharaohs. Timber and iron, rope and pitch, the alchemy of skilled human hands forging what war has always called naval power. Muawiya oversaw every detail with the rarest of leadership gifts, the capacity to govern the granular without drowning inside it. He understood that a hull constructed wrongly in harbor is a coffin built with masterful precision for the deep. He recruited master shipwrights from Cyprus itself, from captives, migrants, and merchants, commanding them to build the very instruments that would transform his civilization from prisoner of the dry land into sovereign mistress of the vast Mediterranean. The great cedars of Lebanon, the same timber from which Solomon had built his legendary temple, fell now by Muslim hands. They would construct warships bearing not Phoenician gold, but a green banner proclaiming something worth far more than any earthly fortune. In Tarsus and Acre, in Tyre and Alexandria, new warship masts rose like victory columns consecrated before any battle had been named, and alongside the vessels, Muawiya was simultaneously forging something far more dangerous, a wholly new military doctrine for an entirely new kind of war. The doctrine was stark in its core and ferocious in its consequence. He who commands the sea commands the world entire. He who chains himself to the land surrenders to his enemies the freedom of raid and retreat and resupply, and that freedom alone defeats all armies. Before teaching his men to sail, he taught them to think like the sea itself. The ocean is not an enemy but the widest road in all existence, and the man who masters its nature holds the keys to every civilization's vital artery. 4 years of construction, training, failure, and ruthless correction passed before a single vessel was truly ready for genuine war. Muawiya understood that haste in this particular arena is not boldness. It is nothing more than an unappealable death sentence written against your own men. Throughout those patient years, he dispatched intelligence agents to Cyprus, mapping every Byzantine movement and every defensive fracture. He catalogued every weakness in that fortress, which had struck at Muslims for so long while believing itself permanently, absolutely, and eternally untouchable. The day came when Muawiya stood before what he had built on the Syrian shore. He saw not Arabs mimicking Byzantines. He saw a fleet conceived by a wholly new and original strategic mind, unlike anything the Mediterranean had yet encountered. In 648 AD, the 28th year of the Hijri calendar, the first Muslim fleet in all of history departed Syrian harbors and pointed its iron prows toward Cyprus. Not one warrior aboard had ever attempted anything remotely resembling this before. The first sailor who saw the blue horizon stretch in every direction without a single visible shore experienced what the chroniclers called the terror of the deep. It is the primordial dread seizing a man when the familiar earth finally and completely abandons him. Yet Muawiya was present, not issuing orders from the safety of dry land, but riding alongside his warriors, sharing their very first fear. A commander who refuses to share the terror forfeits forever his claim to share the glory. They sailed toward Cyprus as the wind hammered the great sails with a force carrying its own iron message. This road grants nothing freely. Pay its toll in courage and cunning and knowledge, or remain safely and forever imprisoned upon the shore. When Cyprus finally rose on the horizon, green and sea-armored and bristling with Byzantine garrison, the Muslim warriors felt precisely what every soldier has always felt. He has planned for this enemy, dreamed of this confrontation, and long awaited this reckoning. Muawiya understood this was no mere coastal raid, but a declaration broadcast across the entire Mediterranean world. The Muslims were no longer prisoners of the land, and their enemies were no longer safe behind any sea or strait or island fortification. The Islamic fleet met a resistance unlike anything forged at Yarmouk or Qadisiyah, not the open-field confrontation, but the fortified island wall that makes siege warfare its own, punishing and separate arena. Here, iron and merciless patience govern the outcome entirely. Because Muawiya thought with cold clarity inside the most burning of moments, he understood that forcing Cyprus into submission demanded no destruction. A treaty achieving the strategic objective was worth more than a war bleeding his newborn fleet dry in its very first campaign. He negotiated a historic double treaty, compelling Cyprus to pay tribute to the Muslims while the island maintained its ties with Byzantium. This strange dual arrangement was itself a diplomatic victory as profound as military annihilation, purchased entirely without annihilation's terrible and irreversible price. The fleet returned to Syria with no man drowned, a fact the chroniclers recorded with something approaching reverent disbelief. This was itself a small miracle, given that most men aboard had first seen open water only months before setting sail toward Cyprus. The true treasure the returning ships carried was not tribute, it was experience, that irreplaceable and living knowledge that no scroll can teach and no battle plan can substitute. It etches itself into muscle and bone long before it ever reaches the mind. Cyprus shattered the treaty the moment it sensed Byzantine power resurging in the east. Muawiya decided without pause the message would return, and this time it would be written in a language admitting no interpretation, no ambiguity, no shadow of possible retreat. In the Second Cyprus campaign, commanded by Abdullah ibn Qays under Muawiya's strategic shadow, the Islamic fleet moved with the controlled confidence of genuine experience rather than raw audacity. Between those two things lies the entire distance between war and slaughter. The Muslims fought ashore after landing, and in this campaign the great companion Muawiyah ibn al-Samit fell martyred on Cypriot soil. Among the expedition also rode the noble companion Haram bint Milhan, she who carried the Prophet's ancient prophecy about this very sea. The death of Haram on Cyprus, fulfilling a prophecy spoken long before the first Islamic vessel had even been conceived, sent every warrior aboard one enormous and unmistakable message. This was no reckless adventure. This was an appointment kept with destiny itself. When Cyprus settled under the Second Treaty and the fleet turned its prows homeward towards Syria, Muawiya understood the first chapter was now complete. What he had built was not a pair of successful raids. It was a new and enduring military institution. The navy Muawiya built was neither Byzantine copy nor the refined imitation of any earlier fleet in all of history. It was a fusion of multiple strategic inheritances, smelted in one crucible and stamped unmistakably with the mark of a rising civilization's original genius. Abdullah ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Sar, governor of Egypt and Muawiya's chosen instrument for the deep water, carried his commander's complete strategic philosophy within his very soul. He would prove before the watching world that the doctrine worked completely, ruthlessly, and without compromise. The philosophy embedded within this navy rested upon one iron and unbreakable principle: continuity. The fleet was not a weapon drawn for one battle and then abandoned. It was a living institution that learns and deepens and grows stronger with every campaign paid for in blood. Muawiya created what might rightly be called the first naval ministry in Islamic history. Supply registers, repair dockyards, structured recruitment networks, and an intelligence apparatus tracking enemy fleet movements across the Mediterranean with the long and unmerciful patience of a master strategist. The harbors of Syria and Egypt coordinated in deliberate and practiced concert. Acre, Tripoli, and Tyre stood as forward stations for armament and repair, and Alexandria, that ancient city of Mediterranean memory, served as the great arsenal feeding the fleet with men and iron and provision. Enlistment operated on voluntary service and structured incentive, honoring Uthman's condition, which Muawiya had transformed from a restriction into a supreme strategic asset. For the willing sailor fights with a fire that the conscripted man can never summon from his resentful and deeply unwilling soul. Within the Islamic fleet sailed men of every bloodline, Arab warriors from Syria and Yemen, Coptic Egyptians carrying the sea in their ancestral memory, and Syrians descended from the ancient Phoenician masters of the deep. One banner, one doctrine, one purpose. That diversity, which a shallow observer might mistake for structural weakness, was in truth a source of extraordinary and compounding power. A fleet carrying multiple forms of mastery possesses answers to crises that a fleet governed by a single mind can never formulate, let alone solve in the heat of open water battle. Throughout those long years of construction, Byzantium watched with eyes that grew increasingly alarmed yet consoled itself with one comfortable and familiar lie, that these warriors of the desert would never master what had taken Rome centuries of blood and catastrophic shipwreck to only imperfectly understand. But dismissing one's enemy has always been the opening sentence in the long and sorrowful chronicle of one's own annihilation. The Byzantines, who trusted the sea as their eternal and unconquerable shield, had fatally misread what was rising, vast and iron-hulled on the Syrian shore beneath their horizon. Because psychological warfare was a structural pillar of Muawiyah's military doctrine, he ensured that every naval campaign delivered a dual message: deterrence to enemies, confidence to his own men, and to the watching world. The unmistakable signal of an irreversible seismic shift in Mediterranean power. Muawiya understood that a fleet which never fights loses its shadow of terror, so he dispatched his warships in continuous raids along Byzantine coastlines, keeping warriors sharp, vessels feared, and his name burning like a brand in the imagination of every enemy king before every cold dawn. The Syrian coast under Muawiya resembled a forge that never cooled. Shipwrights and blacksmiths, sailmakers and rapé makers, navigators and instructors, all laboring without cease. They were building the war machine destined to become the very founding institution of Islamic naval supremacy in the ancient and contested world. In administering his navy, Muawiya employed the leadership method that centuries would study and warriors would revere. Define the great objective clearly, select men worthy of achieving it, grant them full authority and resources, then hold them accountable with unblinking and utterly merciless severity of judgment. He rarely commanded from the safety of dry land. He rode with his men when the hour demanded it, then delegated with surgical and deliberate precision. Ibn Sa'd for Egypt's waters, Ibn Qais for Cyprus and Anatolia. That calculated trust gave his commanders wings and his enemies nightmares. Within Muawiya's fleet there emerged a new class of warrior the Islamic world had never before produced. The naval prince, one who fused the leadership of men with the mastery of the deep and the iron capacity to decide alone inside a killing storm that waits for no counsel. Historical sources record that Muawiya established the first naval signal system in all of Islamic history, a network of flags and controlled fire enabling ships to communicate with one another mid-battle, preserving the fleet's iron coherence as it moved through the savage choreography of open-water warfare. When 655 AD, the year of the legendary Battle of the Masts, was finally inscribed in the annals of history, the true root of that miracle lay not in fortune and not in accident. It lay in years of silent, unglamorous labor by a man who never once misread his mission. Emperor Constans II, grandson of Heraclius, heir to the Byzantine purple, recognized that this Islamic fleet rising like an eagle from its shell had to be shattered before it could take to the sky. He assembled 1,000 warships and sailed himself toward the killing. 1,000 Byzantine vessels against 200 Muslim ships. Every warrior in those contested waters knew these numbers by heart. They convinced the emperor with absolute certainty that what he was conducting was not a battle but an annihilation. Not war, but the erasure of a presumptuous and desert-born people. In the Lycian waters near the ancient city of Phoenix, the engagement that history would immortalize as a battle of the masts, the two fleets drew into formation in a tableau designed by every calculation of established power to permanently extinguish the Muslim navy. But Ibn Sa'd, commanding the Islamic vanguard carrying Muawiya's complete strategic doctrine within his very soul, perceived what the emperor had catastrophically and fatally failed to foresee. The sheer mass of those Byzantine vessels was not their advantage. It was the precise and merciless architecture of their own doom. Ibn Sa'd issued the order that war colleges would study across the centuries, lash the Islamic ships to Byzantine hulls with iron chains and grappling hooks. In one single and brutal heartbeat, a naval engagement was transformed into a land battle waged upon the heaving back of the Mediterranean itself. Suddenly, Byzantine numerical supremacy became catastrophic liability. 1,000 ships that cannot maneuver are not warships, but open fortresses, and within open fortresses, the Arab warrior forged in the close quarters doctrine of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah answered to absolutely nothing in the Byzantine arsenal assembled against him. The battle shifted from the world of sail and rudder into the world of blade and spear and naked courage at arm's length. In that world, the Muslims were absolute sovereigns, descended from the very army that had produced the iron heroes of 3 history-defining land victories in under 20 years. Men fell in multitudes on both sides, across those heaving and blood-soaked wooden decks. The surrounding sea darkened with blood, burning oil, and shattered timber, as though the Mediterranean had itself chosen to record this brutal and magnificent epic in its own most merciless and ancient ink. At the very apex of the slaughter, when the scales tipped with unmistakable and crushing finality against Byzantium, Emperor Constans himself was wounded and fled the field in disguise. He abandoned his fleet to the abyss he had entered so confidently, so completely armored in the full weight of imperial arrogance. When the Battle of the Masts fell finally and completely silent, hundreds of Byzantine hulls lay in the deep or were claimed as war prizes. The emperor had vanished from the field, and Constantinople trembled with a terror it had not known since the shadow of Attila the Hun fell across the ancient horizon. Military historians of the modern era regard this engagement as a turning point in Mediterranean history no less consequential than Yarmouk had been on land. It proved definitively that the Islamic fleet was not seasonal, not accidental, but a permanent structural force claiming irrevocable dominion over the inland sea. When news of the victory finally reached Muawiya in Syria, he displayed, according to all the chroniclers, not the surprise of a gambler who had unexpectedly won. He displayed the deep and quiet satisfaction of an architect watching his great construction survive the most violent earthquake yet measured against it. For what transpired at the Battle of the Masts was neither fortune nor accident. It was the natural and inevitable harvest of years of planning, construction, training, and the ruthless and unglamorous testing that Muawiya had conducted in the absolute silence which only the truly great are content to inhabit. The Battle of the Masts was also a declaration sent to every emperor and every king who watched the Muslims from behind the safety of their waters. They learn from every campaign. They refine their doctrine after every wound. They honor no boundary their enemies have presumed to draw for them. And in the profound silence that descended after the battle, the Mediterranean lying still as a vast sheet of hammered iron beneath a blood-red dust sky, the Umayyad prince in Syria was already thinking toward the next campaign. Builders of fleets never stop at a single victory. When Muawiya became caliph in the 41st year of the Hijra, the navy he had created stood fully and impressively institutionalized, with commanders, budgets, supply chains, and an accumulated institutional memory passing between generations like a living inheritance of salt and iron and hard-won doctrine. His naval ambition did not rest upon what had been achieved. It drove relentlessly forward toward what was still only dreamed. He dispatched his fleet to the Mediterranean islands one by one, then dared for the first time in Islamic history to lay siege to Constantinople itself from the sea. The naval siege of Constantinople was an undertaking of staggering courage and staggering difficulty in equal and matched measure. The Byzantine capital's walls, harbor chains, and the terrible and secret weapon of Greek fire made its breach effectively impossible by any standard of warfare that dark and desperate age possessed. Yet even that failure before Constantinople, if failure it truly must be called, carried profound and lasting strategic value. It bled in exhausted Byzantium and declared to every watching power on earth that the Muslims could bring their warships to the ancient walls of the most impregnable city in the known world. Muawiya died in the 60th year of the Hijra without having opened Constantinople. Yet he died having planted within Islamic civilization the unshakable conviction that the sea is not a barrier, but a road, and that the boundaries of an empire extend precisely as far as its ships dare sail. What Muawiya had built in naval power and naval doctrine continued growing long after his death, producing an Umayyad fleet that struck deep into the Mediterranean and carried the civilization of Islam to shorelines that had known Arabs only as distant names heard in passing merchant caravans. The doctrine he had sealed into the foundation, that the sea must be treated as a permanent military institution rather than a seasonal military adventure, was precisely what would later enable commanders like Khayr ad-Din Barbarossa to accomplish their centuries of conquest, building upon a 7th century Syrian shore's buried inheritance. The history of Islamic naval power cannot be read correctly except through the gateway of Muawiya. Every fleet that came after him carries in its bloodline a seed that this man planted, the man who told the sea with his quiet and iron voice, "I will teach my people to love you and to break you." Every time an Islamic warship drove an enemy fleet beneath the Mediterranean waves, every time a Muslim commander sailed toward an island that no Muslim had ever touched before, there was an echo. It came from that hall in Syria where Muawiya had written his very first and most famously rejected letter to Umar ibn al-Khattab. His naval doctrine, built upon the 4 pillars of continuity, perpetual learning, the absorption of human diversity, and the deliberate transformation of apparent weakness into lethal strategic advantage, is studied today by scholars of medieval military history as one of the most sophisticated naval frameworks the ancient world ever produced. Contemporary military analysis places what Muawiya achieved with the Islamic fleet alongside what Napoleon Bonaparte achieved with the armies of France. The complete forging of an entirely new military institution from a people who had never before imagined that such a thing could rightfully and historically belong to them. Had Ibn Abi Sufyan not insisted, not persisted, not consecrated the full weight and labor of his life to this great project begun as a single rejected letter to a single caliph, the map of the world today would be entirely unrecognizable, Byzantium perhaps enduring. the Mediterranean remaining a Roman lake, sealed from the long reach of destiny. Here lies the deepest and most enduring lesson of Muawiya's naval legacy. Civilizations are not built by momentary decisions, but by obsessions that outlast entire years and entire careers. By persistence that overruns every wall of refusal. By vision bold enough to convince the inheritors when it could not convince the predecessors. The nations that wish to command their own destinies must first command the sea. This truth, which Muawiya understood in the 7th century of the Common Era, remains as operative in the 21st and will remain so as long as water divides the ambitions and the destinies of men. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, beyond all the immense political shadow that 14 centuries of heated debate have layered around his name, was a strategic commander of the very highest order. He understood in his bones that history is not written on land alone, but on iron and wind and the audacity to sail. Stand today on any shore of the Mediterranean, any shore at all, and understand that you are standing where a man once stood. He looked upon this same restless water with eyes utterly unlike any in his generation, and he saw what none beside him dared to see or dared to say aloud. The wave that breaks at your feet now is the grandchild of the waves that carried the first Islamic fleet into the vast and terrifying unknown. And within the blue depths below you there is a memory that does not die with the dying of men. It passes between generations like a heavy and sacred trust, always waiting to be claimed. In the great lecture halls of the world's military academies, when professors trace the birth of naval powers and ask how nations forge entire fleets from absolute and total nothing, they return always, inevitably, to this singular and extraordinary case, a desert civilization that decided to own the sea, and did exactly, completely, and permanently that. The name of the man who made that decision on the Syrian shore 14 centuries ago was Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, builder of the first fleet, breaker of the blue chain, the man who told a civilization rooted deep in its desert, look to the sea. That is your road, that is your destiny, that is your future. The sea is still out there. The question is still out there. Does the civilization still look upon it with the eyes that Muawiya turned toward it, the eyes of the builder, the founder, the architect of empire, or has it returned once more to be a prisoner of the land?